You're listening to the Jōrni Podcast. We spend our lives becoming many things for many people, and along the way, something gets lost. We'll explore the missing pieces in this episode. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Jōrni Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. In this episode, we look at what happens when the roles we play begin to feel like pieces of ourselves scattered in different directions. Many of us sense the fracture but keep moving, unsure of how to bring it all back together. Donna Brown is an internationally recognized brand visionary, speaker, and author with more than 4 decades of experience. She's the creator of brand liberation and value design, innovative methodologies that integrate intuitive insight with practical innovation. Her advisory work supports entrepreneurs, creatives, leaders, and global brands committed to aligning personal awakening with business excellence. Known for blending strategic clarity with spiritual intelligence, Donna helps redefine leadership, branding, and value creation for a world in transition. Here is my interview with Donna Brown. Hi, Donna. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because coming into wholeness, I feel there's so many parts in there that our listeners can really dig into in their own lives and their own well-being journeys. So it's wonderful to have you here today, and welcome to the podcast.
Oh, Petra, I'm really, really happy to be here. And thank you so much. And hello to everybody who's listening as well. And I'm excited to dive in and share both of our wisdoms.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to have you here today. So let's start off, Donna, a little bit about yourself and your story. I feel maybe the parts of your journey or your story that connect to what you do today, and maybe a bit for our listeners also what it is that you do today so they can get to know you a little bit.
I have an evolving way of describing myself because I'm a sort of a bridge between two worlds, really sort of the application of spiritual intelligence to your business and how to use that. And also very practical, tangible, more conventional sort of strategies and approaches, because we're made of all of those things. And I think it's really important to be able to translate the spiritual into the practical and understand that the conventional is also very spiritual. So I work really as a brand visionary for larger brands, but also for individuals and founders and entrepreneurs and creatives. I have quite a mix of people because essentially, I think you'll know this too, that when people approach you for work, it's the type of work you do that attracts them more than necessarily actually what the business is. It could be a legacy brand to designer to a founder or to an ultra high net worth. Those are sort of the people I work with. And what brought me to all of this, of course, I think we do because of our personal stories. So I lived for 40 years in Italy, and my, let's say, conventional business journey, I don't really want to call it a career, but that sort of work and livelihood aspect took so many different twists and turns over the years that it really had me questioning myself. And I think so if you think back 40 years, everybody was a lot more traditional, a lot more conventional. Italy is pretty traditional anyways. There was the tendency, or there still is in many ways, right, to find a label for yourself, to fit into that label, to follow a career path. You're doing this, and then it's implied that you're going to stick with that path. I would be a fashion coordinator. I was working in fashion. Then I was asked to work in home furnishings, and I was asked to design an editorial project like Design Lifestyle magazine. So I went from thing to thing. And the usual cocktail parties, people said, but I thought you were doing this other thing. And I'd feel terrible. I would feel so guilt-ridden, as if I'd failed the thing I left because I couldn't stay there. But that was never the case. I was offered an opportunity that seemed really interesting, and I was very curious. And I allowed my curiosity to lead. But that wasn't looked on very well. So I had a lot of existential crises over this. So I had to start looking at, why are these very different sectors, very different companies, cultural institutions, TV producers asking me to do very different things? It has to be something about how I approach things or how I see things that is the key, not necessarily the sector. For me, it was that understanding that I can see for people what they can't see for themselves, essentially, no matter how big or small the business or the person. I don't want to say people are small, but do you know what I mean? Whether it's an individual or a large group, and what it is they're really here to do, what the essence of who they are is, and what the world really wants from them in that point in time, because of course that changes over the years. When I understood that about myself, I relaxed quite a bit and was allowed myself to just enjoy all the rides and working in all these different sectors, because I understood that I was doing one thing applied to different areas. And I think that that helped me feel less fractured and taught me a lot about how people actually behave, how people interact with the world, if you like. And that in personal or sort of family, private spheres or relationships, and then business relationships, we tend to carry the same sort of roles. People expect the same things from us. And that really opened up also how I see companies and people and brands and anything that's a livelihood. And I would say that in addition to that, a very long and beautiful relationship with Tibetan Buddhism taught me a lot also about how to see business differently and what you might consider the purpose of business or what its possibilities are, rather than an innate purpose that is really more suitable to human flourishing than we have been led to believe or that we have practiced. So it led me to doing what I'm doing now and helping people see that for themselves, see themselves as whole, see all parts of themselves activated in what they're bringing into the world, and how to shape these businesses to really support our flourishing as individuals and as a collective.
Yeah, so beautifully said. And thank you for sharing that. And as you're talking about that, I get the really deep sense that as business owners and involved, obviously, in our branding, there's a certain part of that is also our identity, who we are and how we want to be perceived in the world or what we put out there. It feels like there actually is a very close connection. And you said we take on similar roles in our personal relationships and our business. It feels like this can be, and especially maybe for individuals who own smaller businesses where they're very involved, that this is an extension of our identity. And how well that aligns and works actually will reflect and mirror how well we might feel or how well aligned we might be. What has been your experience with that, especially working with some of the clients maybe that are in a more personal setting? Maybe they're CEOs, business owners, they run those companies, are very intimately involved. How does that connect back to how they see themselves in the world and how they align with all of that?
I think there are a few different aspects to this. I think any transformation that we want to see in something that's a system or a structure or a process, or it has to come from people. The biggest changes, as we know, are personal changes in our inner world, and that shapes how we see everything. How it changes the flavor of what we do. It changes the choices we make. So I think the biggest work for everyone starts with themselves. And because nobody else can, let's say, work on you, if you like, other than you. It's really important to understand that all of the people who undertake this sort of path or this, or seeking something like this, have some sense of awareness. They're on some sort of journey, personal journey. And then you come into clash with what our conditioning is about the containers that we create, right? So they can, and the containers can be for profit, for nonprofit, craft businesses that can be anything. These are all containers, and we have a series of ideas or constructs around them that are not necessarily true. And so it's helping people see how, and they enter into conflict with that. So on the one hand, is there's a huge wave of personal development and the work on also, let's say, top down, but also bottom up, right? Body experiences of working on ourselves and our nervous system regulation and how we perceive things and how we deal with things and how we create is really linked to, I was saying where there's a lot of money being in, I think it's $1 trillion industry, or I don't know, many monies are being spent in this area. But the conflict happens when people are having these big insights and then they go into workplaces that they may have created themselves, and it can be your dining room table. All of a sudden you feel yourself pulled out of this process that you think you're undergoing, this transformation that you are undergoing, and you don't know how to translate it into the things we've been taught. Certain marketing tactics or certain ways of pricing things or certain words that you'll use for buyer triggers and things like that, if we want to talk about business things, that on a small scale and a large scale are all the same. We all remember in Wolf of Wall Street, they're saying like, sell me this pen or sell me this pencil, whatever it is, and the guy has to sell a pen. It really is the same at any scale. I think that there's this conflict that needs a lot of help in resolving. People are looking for, I don't want to say softer containers, but possibly containers that are more empathetic, that are more generous, that are kinder. And we're often not kind to ourselves. Like we're the first people to have listened to a course or watched somebody else's success or follow other people and think they did that and they're successful, so they must be right. They might also be very unhappy, but we don't know that. I think we're in a huge transition phase in many ways in the world right now. And I think that understanding that we have the ability to infuse the things that we create with the values that we most desire or the values that are most important to us. I think the Harvard Business School has done no shade to them, or maybe a little shade, when you're asking what is the purpose of a business and the only line is to provide shareholder value. Then there's no morals in that. There's no ethics in that. There's no integrity in that. There are no limits to that. And we see where that has taken us. And of course, they're not the only people to say that. But when you join their business school, that's the first thing they tell you. It's not true, but it's such a limited and damaging view of what we can create. Human beings are so creative. And if we could see how creative owning a business and seeing how capillary we can make our impact and through the choices that we make and how we treat people and how people feel nurtured within the structure or through the shareholders and stakeholders, I think people would find the changes easier. I think that's the biggest thing. It's helping them to reconcile this. And I think this is the thing that people struggle with a lot, right? How can I be this? Am I going to be good or am I going to be successful? And they're not separate. And I think the new businesses and the new world and the new things that are emerging require you to be good and kind and compassionate to be successful.
That makes a lot of sense for looking at how the world is changing and evolving. And a lot of these, I want to say, older or outdated structures are just no longer supporting our own health and well-being in the way the world is today. We have to consider these changes. And as you said, there's conflict between the structures that exist and how people might want to approach them now. Do you have some insight for listeners on exactly these kind of conflicts? Because many of our listeners are business owners and they are probably very familiar with what you're saying with, I want to do this, but I don't know if it'll make money, or I don't know if it'll be accepted, or I don't know if the shareholders will like that. And also a lot of listeners might be working in places where they feel that they simply cannot align themselves with whatever the powers that be in the company are deciding or are sort of imposing on who's working in that company. So what are some of these steps that people can take to work out that conflict, to work on how can they bring themselves into these containers? How can they make that work, align that better when there is resistance, when there is conflict? Where should they start with that?
I think there are a few answers to that. It's a great question, but it's got a lot of, I think, aspects to it. If you're an employee in a large corporation, John Barrett has done a lot of studies on values and leadership. And essentially, we all have values. We'll have maybe like 3 to 5 values that are most important to us, but there will be one that in the end is most important to us. If the company you work for does not value that, you will leave. you have no choice but to leave, because it's really like the negation of everything that you believe in. That's when they come to those big clashes. And I'm not saying let's leave aside what you might consider toxic behavior, but it's really, if we just go to values, if what they value, something you value, they do not value, you are in a foreign land and you can only live, or you are underwater for the whole time, holding your breath for the whole time you're at work. And that's so against human nature that you will ultimately leave, or it will have or if you can't leave, it will have huge impacts on your mental health, on your physical health, on your family life, on your relationships. I think, first of all, is to, as much as possible, to try and understand what the values of the company are, no matter what they say they are, what they really are. And sometimes that's hard to understand from the outside before you're hired. And when you're on the inside, I think there's lovely work being done on trying to explain to people who work in companies as an employee that you're part of a society. In that society, you're part of a community, and you can choose to have the impact that you want in that community, which has nothing to do with your job role. It's who you are as a person. How do people feel when they interact with you? How do people feel when they've had time with you? But leaving people with that sense of something more, and we also know people who leave us feeling drained. The receptionist can have a huge effect on the well-being of a workplace, not just the manager, not just, let's say, the CEO or the person who makes bigger choices. And I think that's one thing that's important to understand, that as human beings, you have the ability to radiate the things that you care about the most, and your kindness and your compassion and your sense of humor and that sensitivity towards others. That is also a form of leadership. You can lead from wherever you are. I would say that's one thing. Now, businesses have no intrinsic qualities, not even that of making money, because there would be no businesses that are losing money if that was a quality, of an intrinsic quality. If there's no businesses would lose money and but do you know what I mean? When you look at the values of a business like that, again, using these big sort of extreme metaphors like the Wolf of Wall Street attitude, or the only thing we care about is shareholder value, leads you to some very unethical decisions. Those are choices made by people that has nothing to do with the qualities and the values or the things that a business can embody. That's our choice. And I think that we were taught, especially there's certain worlds that are tougher, like finance. There's a lot going on there that doesn't feel amazing. It's very easy to believe that perception. But there are a lot of people, to give everybody a little bit of hope, there are people working at all different levels, for-profit, not-for-profit, CEOs, people who are head of very large groups, working, understanding that businesses are places to nurture people. There are a lot of studies to show that people are more loyal, that customers are more loyal, clients are more loyal, profits are higher. Companies that are perceived, companies, financial institutions, whatever it is, that are perceived to have, that they're more a values-driven business, let's put it that way. So kindness, compassion, generosity, nurturing people. I think that's really important. So there's statistics to support all of this. And I've seen a few examples. When I was in Italy, there's a wonderful CEO of a company who then became CEO of a very large group, the same group that he was part of before, who invested in the people who were working in his factory to get them degrees, to get them qualifications. So he would have to pay them more. And these courses were done on company time. They were not done. It was set up so that the studies were done there. And he knew that in the end it would cost him more, but he invested in his people. But if I'm somebody who wants to better myself and I'm working for a company that's willing to give me an education that they're paying for, and that they will then have to pay me more once I finish my qualifications, how likely am I to leave? There could be other external factors that make me leave, but my loyalty, my let's, if you want to call it brand loyalty, is going to be very high. And when people hear those stories in the community, people are going to think well of that. So I think we have to also understand that we have the ability to influence in a positive way many more people than we think, indirectly. Directly and indirectly, people will hear about, I'm still talking about it. I'm living in a different country. And who knows where people are going to be listening to this from, and they're going to hear that story. So just to show how what a ripple effect this has, and that might inspire somebody else. So I think this understanding that if we can nurture the people that work for us or work with us for what is best for them, that's always in your best interest. I also feel it's time to drop the veil of saying in all interviews, you're my dream company. And in many ways, they could be a dream company, but is that the dream for your life? I don't think when you were in grade 3, you said, I want to work for XYZ company doing ABC job. Those are things that come later. So and it's fine if it is, but it's also fine if it's not. And there was a lot of shame and conditioning and death to your career if you ever say anything like this. In the 80s, that was a big thing, and well beyond that. And I think it's important to, if we could acknowledge that people have lives, that they have interests, and what if the most interesting, I don't want to say most interesting, but the thing that person cares about the most is being a triathlete. Why can't I, as a business owner, support them in that in some way? Whether that's time off, whether it's supporting them and cheering them on in the company and being interested in what they're doing. And because there's been a lot of hiding of who we are, right, in these environments. So I think as business owners, to understand that we have enormous influence on people's mental health, on people's family lives, on people's sense of significance and self-actualization and realization, way more than we think, no matter what their job is. And I think that the tendency has been to look at maybe an employee who has, let's say, let's call it an office job, right? And to then feel divested of any interest or care about what that person's life is and how they're growing and what's important to them and what they're doing. I think that there's a huge container for that as well. And just think of how happy those people will be with you and what richness that brings to our lives. I think those are really important things that people who own businesses and are running businesses, no matter how small, can think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel that is changing a little bit. I've seen companies make those changes. I've felt the difference of what happens, and it is coming. We're moving a little bit, I think, from that mindset of each person has to fight for their own little piece of the cake to coming into, okay, we're part of a collective. Maybe we're part of this company identity, or we're part of a department identity, or whatever that is. And as that, we can support each other, we can share. And I think it's slowly changing towards that a little bit, which I have to say, for our mental health, for our overall well-being, that's a much better space to be in, and a much better space to create. And I feel that when we are very unhappy, either as business owners or as employees, that affects our happiness. It affects our productivity. It affects our creativity. It affects what we, in the end, do with and for that company. So the effects aren't just you will have unhappy employees or you yourself will be unhappy, but this will ripple into a lot of different pieces of work as well, and your personal life, of course. Yeah, really important thing that thinking is changing a little bit, and how we look at that, which I think will be a really good thing. And I know that in your work, you also work with archetypes, and I'm really fascinated by how that piece plugs into what we've been talking about. Do you want to share a little bit about that with our listeners? Because I've never actually heard that done before. So I'm very curious.
There's a lot of work with traditional archetypes, like Jungian archetypes, etc. But what I find with the language, and you as a person who does in some way work with the body and cells and feelings will understand this. If I were to say you're a goddess, or you have the inner archetype of, I don't know, a king or an emperor or a scribe or any number of things, those are words that have very little resonance in your body when you hear those words. If you think about it, you don't identify with them. It's like I'm putting something on you and you're struggling to find what that is. However, these words can be very distant. Words like artist can work very well. If I've already been a creative, I will understand that because I've felt what it feels like, the desire to create, the activity of creation. The word artist, although it could be perceived by some people as something distant, but somebody who has a lived experience of creativity, of practical creativity, will know exactly what that means. So what I found, And this was such a beautiful thing. And I have to thank this wonderful client who was willing to, I had this big insight about her, but it's really applicable to everyone. And she was willing to go on this journey with me. And it's really about finding these pieces of yourself, these archetypes that are living within you, but the time in your life when you were connected to them. For example, her archetypes, so I gave them personal names, and she's done talks with me so I can say her name. There's the lovely Louise, who's very sweet, very kind, very nice. And that has a place, and very happy and joyful. And there's the artist, and there is Smokin' Louise, because she talked about this period in her life when she was very punk. She was like smoking and drinking whiskey and doing all the things and wearing fishnet stockings and had punk hair and all that stuff. In her present day form, that, let's call it version of her, and we all do this, right? Got left behind. And what was so interesting in using these personal names, she knows exactly what that means. She knows exactly how that fits into her life. She knows what it felt like to do those things, be those things, think those things, practice those things. And so what we did was, through a series of guided meditations and visualizations, she went back. It's like, who does she want to be? What would she do? What would she be doing? How can I connect with this part of me that I've left behind? Because our habit is to leave pieces of ourselves behind. And in the mix of this, she went from calling herself Louise, but she's always called herself Lou. It's like the Louise part got shortened. She went back to calling herself Lou. And now this version of Louer than Lou, which is a little nod to Dr. Seuss, right? To be youer than you. In this whole version of yourself, what part of all of these archetypes, what part do they play? How much space do they want to occupy? And so, for example, her inner child had zero space, because she's like, oh, if you do this, 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 I'm good. I don't need more than that. And all of these different parts of herself, they came down to 5, and they all had very specific parts, but to play, but in a certain proportion. And at the end of all of this, it's like, how much of this are you living? Let's say something with lovely Louise's, let's say 6%, and something else is 27%. Another thing is 75. It doesn't really matter. I'm just making up numbers. They don't add. I think I've gone past 100, but you get my point. So each thing in its fullest expression for her highest benefit as a whole person will not have equal roles, equal weight. And what was very interesting is that in a series of events that led her to give a lot of weight to one particular aspect of herself, I had her draw a circle of, this is you, this is Lower Than Lou, completely activated. Where are you now? And she sat and thought and felt about it, closed her eyes, and then her jaw dropped. And she drew a circle that was 100% outside of that circle. And she realized that she had suppressed so many things for so many good reasons, acceptable reasons, that essentially she wasn't living her truth. And what was so amazing about that is that she found it easy. She found it natural, because we were harking back to parts of herself that she remembered, that she knew. And she's a creative. And through this whole process, what was so interesting is because she's a graphic designer, we also did colors and shapes and what would you do, because that's her vibe, right? That's her language. And she went back to, so she had a color palette for this Lower Than Lou, her whole self, her fully activated self. What would she be doing? What would her style be? What does she care about? She's not going to not be a graphic designer anymore. It's not like she's shedding, throwing everything to the wind and going off to do something else. But how can I be more of me? How can I feel like I'm really living my truth and who I am, and move into more of who I can be? And she had this color palette. And then she went back. She said, oh, these would be my colors. But it was in a list. It was like we were doing these exercises, and it was just written down. Then she started making, a few weeks later, she started making some images. And she made some images. She said, I went through my past work. And she pulled out different things as examples. And I said, look at this page. And she said, what? I said, look at the page. What colors did she? She says, oh my God, I've used those colors. So everything was there. Everything was there. And it's recognizing that you haven't lost parts of yourself, that they all have a place. We all have experiences that we have left or completed, even if it's school. right? Or moving away from home. There are lots of things that we leave behind. And there are a lot of people going through big career changes. And I think what's really important to understand there is that if you did something for a long time, or you did something for a certain amount of time, there was some aspect of you that enjoyed that, that wanted that needed that. And there's an essence of that, not necessarily the same actions, but an essence of that can be and probably should be brought into play in a more fully expressed you in the future. And what's been wonderful to see is that this is a very long, slow process, also because of the kind of person that she is. But things are now they've germinated. Her flabbers were gasted, as people like to say. She was shocked at how easy it was. She was shocked at how different it was, but how much it was just the essence of who she was, shown to herself in a different way. But now it's just, after a period of germination, it's just flowing out of her in the way she says, in certain things she shares on social media, and certain ways that she creates, and the way she perceives her work and how she wants to do what she does. It's very moving for me anyways. I find it so special. And I think for anybody who's listening or struggling with that sort of sense of identity, I would say that you are a couple of things. You are your purpose, so you don't have to look for external purposes. And which means that exploration of who you are, what do I want to create? What am I curious about? What makes me excited? What do I want to do? And statistically, the world has to want the best of you. We can't want the worst of you. That's just a logical thing. We will always want the best of whoever you can be, and the best work that you can do, or the best things you can create, or the most delicious, whatever that is, whether it's cookies or art or businesses, it doesn't matter. And to know that all your life experiences there's a meaning behind them, and there's a reason that they were there, and to not abandon yourself when you go into what you perceive as that new version of yourself, especially if you're on a path of awakening. There's a lot of, I used to do this and I'm not that person anymore. There are always treasures to be found there, right?
Wow. I love how you're weaving all of this together. And you're right. We work with archetypes in different kind of settings, and coming out of psychology background myself, there is this piece of the archetypes, but they often don't make a lot of sense. You can't really apply them to yourself without being very confused in the end. So I love that you're personalizing this, that you really are giving these individual names. And Donna, I almost feel like this is something that our listeners could also maybe do on their own after they've listened to this episode, is sit down and have a listen in to see where these pieces of themselves are. Where are these pieces of these archetypes? Maybe they can find some of them and actually, as you explained, make the circle and see if they're even still in there. That would be a fascinating thing for them to try.
If they could drop the word archetype, because it might make them feel weird, you can just say, well, what was I doing when I was at university? What did I love? I used to do this thing, now I don't do it anymore. What did you love about it? What was interesting about that? Because we're allowed also to no longer be interested in things, but there's usually something in there, and we don't always leave things. We tend to abandon parts of ourselves. So I think if you just give yourself a nickname, like I gave her these other adjectives, Smokin' Louise, Lovely Louise, and things like that too. And there was an artist archetype, but she is an artist. She's always been creating. I can say that to her because she is an artist. Do you know what I mean? She is a creative. So there was a lived experience of that with her. That's what I think, that the archetypal work is extremely valid, but the wording we use doesn't always help people feel the reality of that. And that's what's most alive to us, I think. And that's what you are helping people with too, with functional freeze. And that, how do we feel in our bodies? Because it's kind of where it all happens. And I think that also brings you to a sense of wholeness, that lack of dissociation, or understanding that all of these parts of you exist, and you can just pick the ones that you care about the most. And you don't have to take the whole package from the past. It's like, yes, but that one thing, I really loved doing that one aspect of that thing. And I have always found, as in always, no matter how big or how small the company, whether it's with a person or a large company, that everything they are is used and needed and wanted. It's just a question also of getting, let's say, the percentage right, or sort of shifting lens a little bit. But that's exactly what that's all about. And I think that they could find that the coming together of all those aspects is actually the next more, let's call it, on a process to wholeness, right? Of their sort of you or the new self. And that's what I find so interesting, that none of this is lost, right? Nature isn't wasteful by nature, right? There's nothing wasted. There's a reason for everything. And if we look at it in that sense, we can always find some part of ourselves that wanted to be expressed. You can weave that into, let's say, the new iterations of what you're creating. As I said, it works for brands and it works for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I found too in this journey that oftentimes these new iterations, they wouldn't have been possible without the evolution of some of the things that came before. As you said, there's no waste in this. It's a continuous building and creating even as we are evolving. So, yeah, absolutely. Now, if our listeners are curious by what we've talked about, they're probably employees or business owners or in the C level or higher and curious about what we were talking about. How can they connect with you, Donna? And how can our listeners work with you? And how do you work with your clients? And what kind of things do you work on?
I have a few different ways of working together. One of them is obviously this one-to-one work, whether it's taking a close look and sort of a behind the scenes look at a business and working with the owners as to what that could become. As I said, what the world wants from it right now and what's its highest form and an expression. So that ends up being sort of a brand vision and a brand strategy. And it also goes into these are the products and services. Being true about you, this is what you could and should be doing if you want. The same with individuals. And so it's one-to-one work. And I do a lot of speaking as well, because I find that even just communicating these ideas moves a lot for people. And sometimes that's all they need for their next step. So I do a lot of speaking and I love to do that. And I don't really do online courses because, as you can see, a lot of the work is so individualized by tuning into what each person needs. It's really, I found that when I do group work, it's like doing individual work times the number of people in the group. I tend to do that very rarely, but I'll probably be doing a few sort of like public talks or maybe a couple of public classes that are, let's say, available online. I haven't really decided yet. It's not something I tend to do. They can find me at donnabrown.com. The email to write me at is visions@donnabrown.com. From that way, I hope there's not an easy download. I am working on a book that will really, I don't have a release date yet, so I can't commit to that, but really is about the nature of business and lessons from nature and how we can apply those to our business. Because I think you mentioned before, I have a big background also in, let's say, garden design and things like that. The natural world and the plant world has a lot of significance for me. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that as well. And I'm always happy just to hear from people on socials. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not on Instagram. I'm not actually on socials much. I never post anything, but you can find me there. I'll be your friend and I'll connect. And I'm happy to take things from there if people want to reach out.
I love it. We don't all have to be on the socials. It's all about what works for us. So we will make sure we link to your offerings in the show notes as well. So listeners, you can check there on how you can connect with Donna. If it's something that you'd like to explore with her, working with her and connecting with her, then we will make sure we link you up with that. And keep in mind that, as Donna said, these really individual journeys that we go on, not just as business owners, but also as workers, managers, and executives, account executives, we all have these values and visions that we bring to the places where we become creative and productive, our workspaces. This is an individual thing. So enjoy that and let yourself enjoy that. There's none of this, you have to do this or you have to do this, because we do have some choices in that on how we navigate that. And as Donna said, there may be instances where we choose to leave or we choose to do our own business because that's more aligned with who we are and who we want to be. Many different paths to our wholeness, many different paths to aligning with that. And Donna can be a part of that journey if you so choose. Check out the show notes. And Donna, thank you so much for spending this time with me and sharing this wisdom that you have in your lived experience with our listeners and with myself. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's always lovely to have a conversation with you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who's listening as well.
Amazing. And take really great care of yourself, Donna. And thank you for shining this light into the world and making these corporate spaces in our businesses a little bit nicer spaces, more aligned, more compassionate, and I think more appropriate for us whatever the world is evolving into right now. Thanks, Donna. Take care of yourself.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for allowing me to share.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Jōrni Podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Jōrni on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejorni.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.